Good afternoon and welcome to Open Classroom. I'm Janet Gillow, Director of Professional Development for the Brown School, Washington University in St. Louis. Thank you for being with us on a chilly February day. Throughout this presentation, our participants joining us on Zoom, you all are muted. We can neither see nor hear you. We also cannot call on raised hands, but the chat feature is enabled. So please do, as the conversation goes on, put your comments and questions in the chat. And my friend and colleague, Laura Peer, the Training Manager of International Center for Child Health and Development, she will be making note of your comments and questions and bringing you into the conversation later. You will also be hearing from Laura by email later on, as she'll be sending you a link to give feedback about today's program. Before we get started, just want to note that it's February, it's Black History Month. Open Classroom is right at the midway point through a series of webinars we're doing to celebrate and acknowledge the history and contributions of African Americans. This Thursday, so the 18th at 12:30 Central, Dr. Sharita Butler Barnes is delivering a program that's a part of that series. It's called Pro-Trump Era Resistance, Hope, and Mobilizing Among Black American Families. Registration is still open for that program, and we'd love to have you come join us. So I'm going to throw the link into the chat, and please do check out that program and other things that we have coming up, including some very cool stuff related to the COVID vaccine that we're doing in the month of March. There's a program that we're super excited about on March 3rd, so check that one out as well. But now to kick off today's program, it is my great pleasure to introduce Mary McKay, who is the Nydorf Family and Centene Corporation Dean of the Brown School. Dean McKay.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you for you and colleagues, all that you're doing for Open Classroom and lifting up amazing speakers like the one that we have today. So welcome everyone. I'm Mary McKay, and I have the privilege of being the Dean of the Brown School. And really it is my privilege to say thank you to our speaker, who I've known a long time and admire Susan Whitty's work a great deal. So part of the speakers series is the way we've been able to attract colleagues like Susan and others has to do with the strength of the research that happens at ICHAD, our Smart Africa Center, and really, Dr. Fred, your leadership of a team of people that are really focused on vulnerable children, their families across the globe. And so we're incredibly grateful for your leadership, the leadership of the centers, our research program, and thank you for lifting up this speaker series. So with that, Dr. Fred is my faculty colleague here at the Brown School, and so I'll turn it over to you to introduce our speaker. Thank you, Fred.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dean Mary. And again, I also want to thank you, Dean Mary, for your leadership, because without you, this would not be possible. Now, it's my great honor and privilege to introduce whom I call a friend, a colleague, a fellow researcher, someone I really admire a lot, Susan Whitty, who is a social worker and a professor at Columbia University School of Social Work. Susan's teaching and research, broadly defined, involves dissemination of interventions, testing of interventions, and developing interventions that really address HIV and AIDS and other STIs and gender-based violence issues. She's worked with communities of women engaging in sex work for over 20 years now, at least for as long as I've known Susan. She has done this work. And she doesn't only do this work in the US. She does this work in the US, but also she does it globally, where she collaborates with different people, including me. So she has worked in Mongolia. That's when I started collaborating with Susan, when she was working in Mongolia. She works in Kazakhstan. She works in several other countries in Central Asia, but she also works on the African continent in Uganda with me, really to test and add components of financial literacy, business development, vocational training, and micro-savings components in the HIV prevention for women engaged in sex work. So thank you so much, Susan, for doing this, and we look forward to your presentation. I just want to put in one plug that Susan's presentation is going to be recorded, and then people will be able to definitely listen to it, even if you are not able to finish the entire presentation at the end. But we also, as ICHAD and Smart Africa, we have another, and this is just another announcement, that we have a conference coming up. So you should mark your calendar. We have a virtual conference coming up from April 21st to April 22nd. And the title of the conference is South Collaboration to Strengthen Child and Adolescent Mental Health in Sub-Saharan Africa. And we'll be sharing our lessons from Smart Africa. So Susan, welcome.
Thank you so much, Dean Mary and Dr. Fred, for your very warm welcome. Thank you to the whole team who is now working together to bring this open classroom today. I'm delighted to be here. Gosh, on Mardi Gras, and especially thankful to all of you in the audience for attending. I hope you're eating lunch or enjoying some snack or some respite, and can sit back and just sort of listen, and eager to get your thoughts at the end. So thank you for joining us today for this talk around combination microfinance and HIV prevention for women engaged in sex work. I would like to take a moment, if you could please join me in a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking to you from the unceded Lenape land in Piermont, New York, and I'm grateful to be able to speak as a guest on this land. As Dr. Fred said, my name is Susan Whitty, and I'm a social worker and a professor at Columbia School of Social Work, and I'm a happy affiliate of the ICHAD team at the Brown School. So I came to the profession of social work, and specifically to social intervention research, by way of women's studies and public policy. And I was interested in community organizing and applied research. And kind of bringing all those together, I've been engaged in HIV prevention research for about 25 years. And most recently, I'm focusing on the combination HIV prevention and microfinance, which I'll talk about today. This slide is a well-known quote by the Aboriginal activist Lila Watson. "If you've come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And I'm sharing it because I want to take a moment to acknowledge my identities and my positionality in terms of the research that I'm sharing today. I'm a white woman of European descent. I was born and raised in suburban New York City in the United States. I had access to education from kindergarten through a doctoral degree. I'm a tenured faculty member and a behavioral researcher at Columbia University. And I'm also a wife, a life partner, mother, sister, daughter, friend, colleague, and sometime ally or accomplice to friends and colleagues of color. But I think especially during this pandemic, my awareness and of the importance of my positionality as a social work intervention research has grown more rapidly in this last year than it had before. The only identity that I share directly with many of the women in the projects that we'll talk about today is a cisgender relationship as women living in a patriarchal society. I am familiar with some of the gender inequities that they experience, but I don't share the lived experience for most of these individuals. And I think our accountability as researchers to the individuals in our research studies is important. So I'm in the process of exploring mine. And so as I prepared this talk, I was really humbled to reflect on this. And I think the idea that I'm presenting to all of you through this virtual lens, for example, is also, for me, a kind of a truer reflection of some of the disconnect that I've been feeling lately, but also long-term, to the individuals in community that we work with. And I think the current national focus on the grave injustices that are perpetuated by systemic racism, from which I and others benefit, it's a really important time for us as researchers to interrogate our identities and our positionalities. And I hope it invites you to raise skepticism about the words I share and to challenge me. And I hope also for us as senior scholars, but some of you as junior scholars, it invites you to think more intentionally as you do your work and about who you are and what you're bringing in terms of power and privilege. So thank you for that. And I also have lots of people to thank. I can't read everyone on this slide, and not everyone is on this slide, but these are the many teams that I've been had the great good fortune to work with, and including many of you who are here today, from whom I've learned so much, and especially the women who have engaged in our studies. So thank you. So today I want to talk about the state of the literature. What do we know about microfinance and HIV prevention for women engaged in sex work, and discuss some terms and describe this trajectory that Dr. Fred alluded to of 3 studies we've worked on together, to share the findings of one, and to consider some theoretical and methodological limitations. Remarkable changes have been achieved in the last 30 years, and in particular in these last 10. On this slide, this is a timeline for the ARV, antiretroviral medication improvements and policy decisions, for example, PEPFAR, that speak to the great advances in our scientific understanding, but also the significant global health community and leading government and civil society organizational commitments that have been made. And these are real advances. These advances have shifted the way we think about HIV prevention. And I share this slide, it's borrowed from the San Francisco Health Department, because I can't find another one that captures so beautifully primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. So as we've moved through this last 10 years of biomedical investment and innovation, what we've seen is that prevention now incorporates all 3 of these concepts. We're no longer doing what we would call pure prevention. Now, viral suppression, which is achieved through the use of ongoing engagement in the cascade of HIV care, is achieved through the secondary and tertiary prevention, and ultimately that affords primary prevention for HIV negative individuals. And so we now have a much more robust and complex set of outcomes to think about in terms of our work. And this slide shows you that in fact we've made great achievements. Look at the high numbers of people who are living with HIV now and the lowering deaths, we see that. But despite this, we still see persistent new infections, and UNAIDS cautions us that there is unequal progress that we've seen, right? Too many people with HIV or who are at risk for HIV still don't have access to prevention care and treatment, and there's still no cure. So we have to be vigilant. And COVID-19, if we think about the fact that as an urgent issue, HIV affects not only the individuals we work with, but their families, their communities, and the development and economic growth of whole nations. The nations that are hardest hit are those that also have other serious problems, and COVID-19 has exacerbated that. So in recent modeling, we know that it might be because of lockdowns, for example, and a lack of access to ARVs, that as many as 500,000 people may die of HIV-related or AIDS-related illnesses because of the pandemic. So a key barrier to our prevention and treatment remains the stigma and discrimination and social inequities and exclusions. So we have to continue to target those. This simply shows the net changes in the numbers of infections. And I think it's useful for our purposes today because it shows, for example, in Central Asia, that there's a continuing increase related to injection drug use there, but that in Southern Africa, where the heaviest burden of HIV still exists, we've seen great achievements, 28% decreases in the last few years of new infections. So this is both progress and an awareness of where the burdens continue to lie. So here, finally, the share of population infected by HIV is confirmed to be in this part of East and Southern Africa especially. And among key populations that are still at the highest risk, we know, in fact, that women engaged in sex work or sex workers that include men and transgender people and their clients remain among the largest key populations. This action agenda that came out in 2015, you'll notice I've highlighted a couple lines, that the greatest HIV burdens continue to be among African women sex workers in particular. And we see that burden of global HIV infection here in this map that isolates only those adult women engaging in sex work. So these are the geographic locations where we've done this work. It started in Mongolia, which is in East Central Asia. A second project, which I'll report on today, took place in Kazakhstan. And as Dr. Fred alluded, our current work is in Uganda. But before I go a little bit deeper, I just want to know if you would close your eyes for just a second and ask yourself, who is a sex worker? What does a sex worker look like? How would you know someone engages in sex work? And what is a female sex worker? Did you already picture someone who identifies as a cisgender woman? It happens today that I'm only going to be talking about cisgender women, but there are many sex workers who are men or transgender folks who engage in sex work. And the field largely endorses this term, female sex worker, FSW. So you can open your eyes. But I wanted you to conjure this person or persons in your mind, because I think that this issue of terminology is important for us, and it actually speaks to some of the issues that I think we see in our lack of or inconsistent findings. So we've long endorsed the term women engaged in sex work in our studies. And HIV activists and advocates over the last 20 years have moved in many areas to person-first terminology, like people who are living with HIV, people who use drugs, or people who use injection drugs, or men who have sex with men. But for some reason, the acronym FSW, female sex worker, has prevailed. And so we know from our literature that, and from our experience, that women who engage in sex work are not an identity. It's not even a full-time form of earning income, but it's often a form of survival, barter for housing, food, alcohol, drugs. So transactional sex is probably a better term. And if we define sex work as transactional sex, or not one clearly defined practice, but a broad continuum of sexual services that we voluntarily engage in for things of value, you can actually consider sex work as part of a political economy of sex that affects all of us, right? So including traditional marriage and partnership. So do I engage in sex work, I ask myself, or do you? And how relevant is that to what we're talking about today? So these are the kinds of things I would like you to consider. But sex workers are objectified in popular culture and HIV prevention, and we see devastating stigma and discrimination. And as we've seen the grave impact that this identity has in terms of global HIV burden, it's of great concern. So I argue that there's a big issue here that we need to unpack that's really important. And then the second piece of that is this idea of a sex worker engaging in sex work and the relative choice that one would have, and whether or not our work that seeks to reduce risk and move individuals either away from sex work or out of sex work is this question of, are we doing rescue and rehabilitation, or are we advocating for sex work as work? And so without taking too much of a digression, what I mean to say here is that we know that there are very strong empowerment organizations like the Global Network of Sex Work Projects that seek to enforce sex work as a form of work, as a form of labor, with respect to decriminalization, full access and resources and training. And our work, or my work in particular, as it's evolved through our team's work, began in Mongolia at the invitation of a colleague who was working with women who, shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, found themselves with education but without access to a labor market, who engaged in survival sex. So we see globally that there's another group of women who engage in sex work, or individuals who engage in sex work, who are doing it for the purposes of survival, who also happen to be at very high risk for HIV and other STIs because they don't have access through identity, through mobilization of communities of sex workers to what they need in order to be safe. And so we don't really fall under either of these phrases, rescue and rehabilitate. We're not trying to encourage people to leave sex work. And we're also not necessarily only reinforcing sex work as work. I would say that what we're trying to do is look at harm reduction and enhance choice, so that anyone who engages in sex work could have access to alternative forms of income. And that's been sort of the philosophical goal in a lot of the work that we've been doing. So our research work was originally targeted to combining microfinance with HIV prevention. And there were, I'm sorry, I just lost my slide. And so what we see is that women who engage in sex work, they do that in order to generate income. We know that's true. We know that as they engage in sex work, they face economic hardships that are great, including seasonal variability, lack of control over working conditions, disruption to income, and that if they're using alcohol and drugs, they also experience exacerbated poverty, unemployment, lack of access to education, and other gender-based inequalities that are significant. Microfinance is the term that we started with back in the mid 2000s, but of course the terminology that we're hearing now is expanded. So microfinance has been identified as a component for structural interventions addressing HIV prevention. It remains a fast-growing strategy to address poverty, and the structural interventions we know can address social, political, economic, or environmental risk contexts. And that's why we're engaging them, in order to enhance our risk reduction. And so these terms such as economic empowerment and household economic strengthening have also become part of the microfinance intervention world. And these grayed out circles show the specific components that we've sought to target in our work: financial literacy, vocational training, savings, and match savings.
Dr.
So,
Susan?
Yes, please.
Is it okay if I share a question from one of our participants?
Oh yeah, sure, that'd be great.
Deidre asks, is it possible that sex work has increased as a result of the pandemic?
Wow, that's an excellent question. I haven't seen any literature to suggest that that's the case. In fact, what we see at least in Chatarakera in Uganda is concerns that women are losing income because sex work has been decreasing for them because of lockdown conditions. So it's a great question, and I would like to look further to see if that's possible. And at the end, I would love to hear what is going into your thinking about how it's possible that that has that the pandemic might have exacerbated it, as maybe as a form of additional income because of lost employment. Thank you, Deirdre. So I just want to spend a couple minutes here thinking about what we see in the literature. So there's a burgeoning literature now, lots of reviews that are looking at HIV prevention and microfinance. And so when we started the work, we wanted to look at the innovation of HIV prevention to bring it out in a way that could target better the environmental structures, and microfinance promised to do that. And we began to see mixed outcomes that were connecting these microfinance interventions with improved HIV prevention outcomes. And then we started to see studies, including our own, that was able to show specific improvements for women who are engaged in sex work. So this particular piece by Krishna Ratney in 2016 is a systematic review of reviews that was funded by the Gates Foundation of any HIV prevention to strengthen the prevention cascade, the HIV prevention cascade. So essentially what we were looking for is those that target socioeconomic barriers, to look for the microfinance. And within this 88 eligible reviews, they found 292 primary studies, and they sorted them by categories that looked at type of prevention. And without getting too much into the weeds, one of those areas was adherence to prevention. So supporting adherence to prevention, in other words, those interventions like microfinance, which could address the socioeconomic barriers that allow one to adhere to prevention concepts. And what they found is that the social barriers that include stigma and poverty that threaten our access to reduce HIV incidence, that combination microfinance can be effective at increasing that access. And this suggests that the mechanism at play in these interventions is to remove the structural barriers, which is what we were looking for. And so we feel very, I feel very excited by that possibility that may be the case in the long term. And the Gibbs is a scoping review where they looked at 45 separate studies to look at economic interventions that were seeking to prevent HIV or intimate partner violence. And it turns out that only 3 of the 45 target women engaged in sex work, and that they didn't include outcomes related to partner violence, but only HIV prevention. And what was important here is that there were three. One of them was actually our own study on Darga, but the other two really focused on sex worker mobilization interventions versus our standalone interventions. And what's important about that is that community mobilization is really important, and I suspect a wave in the future to see more sustained interventions for sex work communities. But what they raise in concern, which is part of what we were discussing earlier, is this idea of the definition of a sex worker. And so many individuals don't identify with that identity. And so in order to target mobilization efforts, you need a community that identifies in a like-minded way. So what's happening is for those successful interventions, it's leaving out or losing, it's leaving out individuals who don't see themselves as sex workers, but are still engaged in transactional sex. So this is another area that we have to think about. This last one by Swan, I'm going to go to a few more slides, is a large systematic review of household economic strengthening interventions for HIV prevention. And what they describe is interventions where they break them into three different areas: provision, protection, and promotion. And so the provision, I'm going to actually go to the next slide because I think it's really terrific. So I want to give you a second to take this in. The key here tells us that these are all the forms of microfinance interventions that they looked at across all studies. And the row shows us that these are the different outcomes. The direction of outcomes that they saw are green or red or yellow, depending on whether they're positive or not. And their relative size of the circle that demarcates them, or the square, is the relative quality or rigor as a ranking of scientific rigor. And then whether or not the circle is filled in or not has to do with whether it's a combined intervention or it looks at independent effects. And so the strongest and the most conclusive evidence comes from these provisional, sorry, one second, I knew this would happen. Come from these provisional, like giving unconditional cash transfers and conditional cash transfers are among the most robust microfinance interventions that are showing reductions in individual self-reported risk behaviors. They're not always showing the same clinical outcomes. So one of the issues that we've identified is the need for clinical outcomes. For women engaged in sex work particularly, none of these have been engaged with those target groups yet as of the publication of this, which was in 2015, I believe. But the savings interventions, this is our Darga intervention, the savings group and individual interventions are the ones that are showing protective effects for women engaged in sex work. And so what this review highlights is a discordance between positive self-reports and clinical outcomes. And so it tells us we want to think more about clinical outcomes. And it also suggests that our self-report outcomes might risk lack of validity. So we have to think more about how we can strengthen those. But it also suggests that even given these robust outcomes across the board, that there's a need for additional qualitative and mixed methods research to understand the mechanisms of the effects. So like so many other areas of our interventions, we're not sure why we're seeing the outcomes, and we need to dig a little bit deeper to get at some of the reasons for those. And then this final piece that I'd like to share, this slide is about individual versus community economic strengthening approaches. And I think the reason why there's not really a systematic review or scoping literature piece yet about these community engaged strengthening approaches is there's not that many yet, because they're really hard to do. They're compelling and they're important. And in a chapter that Mancios in 2018, first authors, they speak to the conceptually different approaches between individual level studies like ours and community level studies like those reflected in some of the reviews, where whole communities are targeted for outcomes, not just individuals. And they offer some very compelling cases, such as the Iringa trial in Tanzania. And Gibbs's work, the scoping review, does point to the success of these mobilization efforts, but again, remember the concern about identity. And then there's a great piece in 2019 by Cowan that it's a small review of strategies in the last 2 years, strategies that promote meaningful involvement of sex workers. So really that's where some of our future lies, is in thinking about the strongest strategies for engaging sex workers or women engaged in sex work more intentionally in the work. But they essentially call for the inclusion across the board of more sex work community members in the work we do. So we're starting to see a beginning set of emerging methods issues related to eligibility criteria, definition of sex work, other contextual factors, intervention types, what are the components we're using, individual and community level issues, outcome focus, areas of prevention, and level of community engagement and the role of sex workers. So I want to turn to our studies, and I'm going to move a little bit more quickly because I want to make sure I cover everything. The first study that we engaged was Undarga, which means wellspring. And it was the first study. It took place in Mongolia, started in 2006-07. And we were invited to do HIV prevention work in Mongolia and ended up doing a combination piece of work there, because while there was very low prevalence, the prevalence of HIV was very high in this emerging group of women engaged in sex work. And they were doing survival sex and very interested in finding ways not to reduce their risk for HIV, but to engage in microfinance. So they asked us to develop an intervention to test it. And this is when I very gladly joined, locked arms with Dr. Fred Suomala, whose work in asset-based theory and asset accumulation informed our thinking. And so Undarga included HIV risk reduction, a very basic involvement in HIV risk reduction, but it added financial literacy training, business development training, vocational mentorship groups, and a 2-to-1 match savings. And we decided to intentionally avoid microcredit or microloans because of the vulnerability of women and because of the success that Dr. Fred had been seeing on the African continent using asset-based microfinance in other economic empowerment interventions. And so we did this study with 57 women who were engaged in sex work in the microfinance intervention compared to 50 in the treatment alone. And these were all individuals who reported having engaged in vaginal or anal sexual intercourse in the last 90 days in exchange for either money, alcohol, or other goods. And what we found, and just very quickly, the findings were pretty robust and exciting. At 6-month follow-up, what we saw is that the HIV sexual risk reduction plus microfinance participants reported significantly fewer paying sexual partners, and they were more likely to report 0 unprotected vaginal sex acts with their sexual partners. So we saw great risk reduction in just that one group compared to the control. And then in terms of economic outcomes, we saw that women who attended microfinance plus HIV prevention sessions reported a significantly lower percentage of income from sex work, increased odds of reporting no income from sex work, and increased odds that sex work was not their main source of income. And most importantly, we didn't see a falling off of women's capacity for income. So we saw no change in overall household or individual income. And so these are just some of the women and the businesses that they developed as an outcome. And so the implications from this study led us to expand the work into Kazakhstan, where there was an increasing number of women engaged in sex work living or at risk for HIV due to injection drug use. What we found essentially was that this was possible. Match savings are safe and can assist in changing habitual behaviors. We didn't find adverse events. We saw women's confidence increase. We saw savings that enabled and a range of services and capacity to open a business. But we believed that opening the business was challenging. And so as we thought about expanding this work, we thought about changing slightly as we moved to Kazakhstan, the way in which we set up the intervention. And so we expanded the study to 350 women, and we included outcomes that were not only based on self-report, but included incidents of STIs and HIV. And we moved to vocational training specifically with mentorship, because it standardized the capacity for increasing one's vocational skills. Where business development was very varied and harder to sort of scaffold, we felt that it was important to standardize the findings or the intervention base. And this is a study protocol paper that essentially describes the detail of the study itself, and I can offer a list of references at the end for those of you interested in looking more closely. It was very similarly matched, except for the change in the intervention component that was vocational training. And the eligibility criteria included women who report illicit drug use within the past 90 days, or 12 months rather. So because we knew that a driving force in the epidemic was drug use. The theoretical framework, like the original Undarga, is mostly focused on asset theory and social cognitive theory. And this is just an image to give you a sense of what Almaty and Timurtal, the two cities where this study took place, look like. This is our concert diagram. It shows 400 enrolled participants, 350 who were essentially randomized to one of the two conditions, the risk reduction alone versus the microfinance. We followed them over 12 months, so we had an expanded and sustained follow-up period. Vocational training included hairdressing, manicure, pedicure, and sewing courses, and these were specifically developed and selected based on the advice of local partners, including a women's small business association, and they were vetted through a pilot group of women who met the eligibility criteria. And this is another paper about the intervention in more detail. If you would be interested, it talks about the components, and it speaks in a qualitative way about what it was like, what the challenges were in terms of implementing this intervention. Key takeaway process measures include that there was great attendance on average, 3.6 sessions out of 4, 5.2 out of 6 for financial literacy, 19 out of 24 for vocational training. And that we did see savings activity where 18 women opened a formal bank account, 121 in a NOVA account, and 107 deposited savings. And we saw at least 75 women, or roughly 42%, who were able to get their match. So these findings actually were just accepted in a manuscript by the Journal of the International AIDS Society, and we're awaiting the proofs. And so I would just ask that anyone watching the talk would embargo and not share these findings in any public way until it's published, probably in the next 2 to 4 weeks. So just let me know if you would like to, and I'll let you know if they've approved that. So to be respectful to the journal. But this is a simple look at our baseline table. What it shows is that the average age of women was 34, that most of them had completed high school, about a third were single, most had very acute adverse issues in their lives, homelessness, not enough money to buy food in the past 90 days, an average of 10 years in sex work. And what it shows is that the groups were very well matched in terms of randomization. So the big spoiler alert is that we actually didn't see any biomeasure outcomes. So this shows incidence rates for STIs. It shows the number at baseline, and then it shows the number at 1 year follow-up. And we didn't see any significant difference between the two groups in terms of either HIV or STI incidence. The new cases were fairly comparable, if trending a little bit lower at 12-month follow-up. So one would argue that a larger sample size over time might have allowed for those effects to emerge, but we don't know for sure. These next tables show, let me just briefly describe each outcome by each condition and then the comparison. So what we're looking for here is, if this is, it's multi-level models to establish quantitatively the effect of change from baseline to each follow-up point, and then the difference in the change between the two conditions. And so that's the third line. And what we're looking for is dark. We want darkness and boldness here. And what you'll notice is there's not a lot of that. What we saw, which was pretty remarkable, is that both conditions showed significant reductions in primary behavioral outcomes for both arms. And so, for example, right here in the HIV risk reduction, what you can see is an 82% reduction at 3 months, an 85% reduction at 6 months, and a 90% reduction at 12 months in the number of unprotected acts of vaginal and anal intercourse. And that happened for both conditions. And remarkably, we saw that for almost all of these outcomes. There were 2 specific areas where we did see significant change between the 2 groups. Right here, what you can see is a 72% reduction in the number of unprotected acts with paying partners at 6-month assessment, but we don't see it carrying into the 12 months, so it's not sustained. And then we did see, for proportion of income from sex work, a 10% greater reduction in the proportion of income from sex work at this 3-month time point, but again, not carried through the other 2 time points. These tables are the secondary behavioral outcomes, such as number of sexual partners, number of paying partners, financial self-efficacy, social support. And again, we see the same trend where for most of these outcomes, we see reductions, but we don't see significant differences where we want to see them to show the intervention effect. The one outlier, or the one main finding, is that for financial self-efficacy, we do see robust findings sustained over time. So in fact, for financial self-efficacy, we do see that the microfinance intervention did have an effect. And so again, these are coming out very shortly in the published press. But for our purposes today, in summary, I think what we see is that both arms were able to significantly reduce sexual and drug use risk behaviors, and we didn't see that much difference. So the question is why? We would argue, or I would argue, that it's possible that a robust HIV risk reduction intervention alone might be sufficient to reduce the HIV sexual and drug use risk behaviors among women who engage in sex work. But my guess is that probably our structural intervention was quite limited in its ability to reach this particular group of women who have such acute issues going on in their lives. And so we have to dig deeper and look more closely at the data and do some additional qualitative work, looking at our qualitative interviews to try to figure out what exactly happened there. But that work brings us to Chaterekera, the study that we're doing in Uganda currently. This is the study protocol. Again, it's very similar to what we did in the last 2 studies, although we had 3 intervention conditions. And I'm going to try to finish up in the next few minutes. We have the HIV risk reduction, financial literacy again, and unconditional match savings, which is new. But the vocational training component that we were going to include, we're going to have to actually do without because of COVID lockdown. So the design of the study has changed since we originally set out the protocol paper to include essentially 2 groups that received, one that receives the HIV risk reduction only, compared to one that receives the financial literacy and an unconditional match savings. We do have added to our behavioral and biomeasure outcomes the addition of, not listed here actually, viral load and adherence. So we will be able to look at secondary and tertiary prevention outcomes. Our theoretical framework remains consistent with asset theory and social cognitive theory. We haven't expanded that yet. And the protocol, essentially where we are, is just about here, time 2 to time 3, doing 6 and 12-month follow-up. Our recruitment, rather than 990 due to COVID, stopped at 542. We still have enough power to identify significant differences between groups. We've done that power analysis and received our reassurance from NIH that they scientifically support the decision to stop recruitment given COVID, and we're continuing with our additional data collection. And in terms of baseline and biomarkers, what I wanted to show here is that among these 542 participants, 41% of women are already living with HIV. And so this is actually a primary and secondary prevention intervention. And Indeed, we see the burden of HIV here, and we're very concerned about being able to show outcomes that reduce risk among both groups and show sustained viral suppression. So where do we go from here? That's the question. And I want to hurry up and open it up to some conversation and discussion. But I think as I think about the work that we've done so far and where we are, I think specifically about expanding the theory basis that we've been using, and to think about syndemic theory, which many of you probably know from Meryl Singer, but also it's been applied by Ron Stahl and Tim Rhodes. And to think more about, because biomedical influences have required us to think in terms of a single outcome, like risk reduction related to no new infections. As social workers and social work researchers, this biomedical reductionism has really impacted our getting back to starting where the person is in context and thinking about the multidimensional components or concepts that capture the array of factors that contribute to these epidemics, right? So I almost feel as if a syndemic theory and an approach that looks at HIV related to alcohol and substance use, related to violence and trauma and stress and depression more intentionally could help us to develop multi-component interventions to more effectively get at some of these issues. And this is a very crude way to think about syndemic theory. I went to causes of death across 183 countries. And just as a comparison, if we think about what's different in terms of the syndemic issues, from Mongolia to Kazakhstan, for example, alcohol use might be seemingly comparable, but drug use is a much higher cause and concern for major syndemic issues among those living with HIV than in Mongolia. And it's not almost not at all an issue in Uganda. Whereas issues of violence, for example, or HIV infection itself, and as a poor proxy for a level of poverty or lack of resources, malnutrition, we see very uneven experiences across regions. And so we can't really compare these outcomes across these particular groups of women. And finally, I would argue an increase in engagement at all levels in community. And so that means from engagement, from developing the study all the way through to dissemination and thinking about how we can increase more collaboration. And we've done that a great deal with the Cha-Tara-Kara study. And I hope that what it does is it shows itself in the outcomes. And so finally, thinking about target population, clarifying how and why sex work and transactional sex is defined. Is it an identity or a behavior? What are the contextual influences? Thinking about syndemic approaches, including contextual issues, and actually thinking beyond HIV risk to social justice and human rights theories and tackling policy level change. And then in terms of design, introducing more multi-phase optimization strategy trials, most trials that could isolate the intervention effects to help us look more closely at what it is that's happening, depending on what microfinance elements we're incorporating, and increasing levels of community engagement, specifically around NGOs, to build community, to be able to target community. And that can take a decade. So those are the kinds of longer term projects that I think we needed to start 20 years ago, and lots of folks are starting to do, but we need to do it with more intention now. And then finally, enhancing our mixed methods work with qualitative evidence to allow us to delineate potential causal pathways. So we're already behind in our AIDS, or in the epidemic plan for 2020. And our current goals are for 2025 to have these targets, but COVID is putting us behind. So I thank you for your time, and these are my thoughts, and I look forward to your reflections and questions. Thank you. Thanks.
I know Dr. Fred wants to thank you, but I just want to open it up quickly. Thank you so much, Dr. Susan. That was amazing. I hope our audience will type their questions in the chat, and we have time for a conversation. So please share your questions. we can keep the conversation going amongst the panelists as we wait. Here's a question from Betsy. Can you talk a bit more about community involvement and steps you have taken to involve community members?
Sure. Well, I would say that Chaterakera with the ICHAD team in Masaka has done a terrific job of engaging community. Community has been involved in every aspect of the intervention and design development, from being able to help identify the hotspots that are being targeted for the recruitment, to how well the assessment elements and the intervention elements meet the needs of the local community. And we did this through a community collaborative board that includes women who are engaged in sex work, but also members from conflicting communities like the police, or from the pastoral community, or from NGOs or other local government. And in those conversations, we've been able to draw out potential impediments, but also facilitators to improve how we can design the study for implementation that's smoother, and frankly, for more likelihood of sustainable use, assuming that we see positive outcomes, because these were all developed with the support of the CCB, so that, and the other piece I would add is that the trainers, rather than have only our own research staff do the interventions, there was a train the trainers intentional capacity building element where local community health workers were trained in the HIV risk reduction. And we hope to expand that so they can be trained in all of the elements. And I think this will help. I think this will definitely strengthen the findings. And of course, we'll have to wait and see. The pandemic did impede our ability to continue, as you saw, to do vocational training with women. And in fact, women were suffering, and Dr. Fred and the team made an executive decision to offer income payments as part of the research during this time that women were unable to engage in sex work, to keep their own households going. And so there was a one-time payment made to help women. But this is part of the challenge of this kind of work, is that history is real and impedes on your outcomes, and it's hard to explain them unless you look at that as limitation. I see, Marion, will targeting the communities more challenge our traditional ways of comparing study conditions? How do you think this would look at study arms of the study in a broader community context? So I guess my fantasy, Marion, would be that we would engage designs that are more in line with the thinking of Linda Collins and MOST, and in identifying study conditions that can meet the needs of local communities. And so I actually need to immerse myself a little bit more in how those factorial designs could be identified. But I think we need to get away from the standardization that we look to often and start to look at the ways in which communities vary slightly, and to take into consideration those contextual factors, such as injection drug use, higher access to alcohol. I think in our own study, we see more transience among certain groups of women, for example, in fishing villages, as opposed to away from those areas. And so there's still a lot to be done to try to refine methods to be able to look more closely at some of those contextualized factors.
And actually, Dean Mary had a follow-on question to the how were you received in the various communities and by the participants themselves?
So this is something I can take absolutely no credit for, because it's all about the ICHAD team in Uganda and in Masaka in particular. They have been very well received by the community, by all members of the community, because they are intentionally trained and prepared to, in a very lovely and deferential way, empower members that they engage in as researchers. And so I think to date, we've been very well received. And a measure of that is that community members aren't shy. They will challenge us, and they will insist on certain changes made to elements of the research design that maybe we're not always happy about. But I think as a power issue, I'm always looking for a willingness to push back. And because we see that pushback, I assume that there is a higher level of trust potentially among some members with our research team. And I think that bodes well for the science.
And there's one follow-up. Thank you for a great presentation. This is from Bethany. Did your findings support country-specific policy reform efforts, such as decriminalization of sex work?
That's a great question, Bethany. Actually, you know, I think in Kazakhstan, it's very possible that the existing team through the Global Health Research Center of Central Asia may be promoting some thoughts moving forward. So since the findings will just be published in the next few weeks, I think that that's the next step is talking about how we can leverage findings to speak to policymakers about these issues. I know that the team is in touch with NGOs who have the ear of some of the government policymakers who would be interested in looking at this. I think another issue that I didn't touch on at all, though, it has to do with culture and a conservative culture that might push back against things like decriminalizing sex work or legalizing syringe access. I think that Kazakhstan is moving in the direction of opening, we know, more access to syringe exchange and to methadone maintenance clinics. And so that's a step in the right direction. But I would have to point to Nabila and the team in Kazakhstan to actually answer this more accurately.
And Lila had a similar question about policy.
Sure, policy recommendations. I think the decriminalization has to be so, but I think a bigger issue that we all who work with women engaged in sex work or any sex workers know is stigma. Stigma and discrimination is the biggest challenges are in targeting community level interventions that help to reduce stigma. And so part of the exercise at the beginning of the talk where I was asking about us to think in our own ways, how are we on the spectrum? And why is it that we as societies and cultural groups otherize certain individuals who engage in something for different purposes slightly than we do? Because we're so close. So I do think that looking at decriminalization, and I think the recommendations would vary greatly by country. I think in Kazakhstan, we need to look at issues related to access to needle exchange and syringe exchange. And in Mongolia, that wouldn't be an issue at all. In Mongolia, the issue would have to do with access to treatment beds related to alcohol use because of the high levels of alcohol use there.
I think I skipped one from Tony. Please talk more about the impact of microfinancing.
The impact of microfinance. Can you say more specifically, Tony? I think, do you mean what we learned about how microfinance played out? So we know in Mongolia that a few of the women who were able to develop their businesses had sustained those businesses. But as you would expect, out of a group of 100%, it's less than 10% were able to sustain the businesses. So I would argue that in microfinance interventions, which is why many people are promoting community mobilization, the biggest single issue is a sustainability or a scaffolding of resources to continue past the research for implementation purposes that would be endorsed by government or also other local officials or large foundations that have an interest in seeing the microfinance lead to other economic improvements that are countrywide or national. And so that's another area where we have a lot more work to do. And in Kazakhstan, we did see a number of women who were using their vocational training skills on a small informal level as opposed to a formal level to offset some of their income from sex work.
Great, well, thank you. We're pretty much at time, so I'm gonna hand it over to Dr. Fred if you have any parting words before Janet kind of closes us out for the day. Thank you so much, Dr. Susan.
Thank you so much, everyone.
No, just to thank you so much, Susan. You never disappoint. Thank you so much.
I just want to add my thanks. I'm deeply cognizant that each one of these numbers represents a real human being and a person just living in great adversity. And I'm just so grateful that you're looking into the best ways that we can help them and then also preserve public health in their communities. So Susan, thank you so much for being a guest on Open Classroom, for sharing this really important work. To my colleagues at ITAD and Smart Africa, always a pleasure to just have a window into the fantastic work that you all are doing. And to the audience, thank you for hanging in with us for another Open Classroom. We hope to see you back very soon. In the meantime, please stay warm, healthy, and safe out there. Goodbye, everybody.